Thank you.
I'm Paige Bay, and I'm one of the volunteers who are working with, with people from Puget Sound. And Lindsay Fraser right here, she's also the other volunteer. And as Ray mentioned, we've been working on this Otters Cafe. This is the first out of the 3. So there will be another one in May, first, and there will be one more after that. And we're still deciding the day and the topic. For tonight, we were able to, fortunately, get gin coffee for tonight to speak about sea otters. He comes with 35 years of experience in the marine science field, and he has his bachelor's in biology from Long Beach State University, and he has his master's in wildlife biology from Polytechnic State University. And he's been up in Alaska doing his research with the U.S. Geological Survey. And he'll be coming up here to share with us what he's doing.
Thanks. This is Millie. She's a retired seeing eye doctor. That helps. Extremely well behaved. It's live up there.
Can everybody hear Jim, or should we try using the microphone?
Yeah. Let me start. I have a voice. Is it carrying okay? Anybody? Anybody?
Now that the train is gone.
Oh, now that the train is gone. Yeah, right. Okay. Well, so thanks for the introduction and the opportunity to speak to you tonight. I have been a research scientist for the past 35 years. I've had the good fortune of basically having a career that I spend dedicated to researching a single species in a single system, sea otter. So we adopted her. She's retired. We adopted her a year and a half ago. She was superbly trained. She was almost a machine. And it's been our job over the past year and a half to teach her to be a dog. She just demonstrated how she's getting to do that. So anyway, I've had the great luxury of studying sea otters in coastal marine communities for the past 35 years. And I'm pleased to be able to share with you some of what I've learned and some of what we've learned as a community over that time. I deal exclusively in science. I don't deal in policy. I stay away from it.
Lucky you.
I just don't understand it. So, but I'd be happy to entertain questions about policy because I do have an opinion. I'd be happy to share those. So I'm going to talk about mysteries of sea otters. Now, many of the mysteries I'm going to talk about, I mean, that's what I've been doing for the past few decades, is solving some of these mysteries. So many of them I'll present as solved mysteries, but I also will try to present a few of them that we haven't solved. And obviously there are quite a few of those. So basically what I'm going to talk about is the history of sea otters over the past 250 to 300 years. We don't know very much about them kind of before the fur harvest, other than they occurred in archaeological wins throughout their entire range. But there's just not very much known. Now I'm going to talk about the more recent history over the past couple of decades, because as populations have recovered and recolonized new habitat, there's been some changes in their demographics and their population trends in the past couple of decades that are pretty interesting. And I'm going to talk about a science project. So I'm getting ready to retire in another year, and I was given the opportunity a few years ago to kind of develop and design a research project that kind of encompassed what I've learned over my career. And I'm going to talk to you about that project and how it might be relevant to your work and your thinking about marine systems in Puget Sound. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about sea otters, and specifically sea otters in Puget Sound. So that's it. So this is an image, of course, of the North Pacific. The red line simply illustrates the historic range of sea otters. So basically they occurred from the northern islands of Japan. Let's see if I can. Anyway, Japan over here. Pardon?
Cursor would work on the machine.
Oh, you know, you're right. Yeah. But not very well. But anyway, I'm not going to. So they occur along the Kuril Islands of Russia, formerly Japan, through the Kamchatka Peninsula, and then across the Egyptian archipelago, and on the west coast of North America down to central Baja California. And they occupy nearly all of the nearshore habitat. So the distribution of sea otters is limited by their ability to dive to the seafloor. They have to dive to the seafloor to get virtually all their food. So they basically can't exist feed in water that's deeper than about 300 feet. That's about the maximum depth they can dive to. So if I drew the line with that they actually occupy, you couldn't even see it up there. So this is greatly exaggerated. It's basically the width of their habitat depends on the bathymetry, the slope of a continental shelf. But they only occur from basically the intertidal zone, and they rarely, if ever, go into fresh water, and they occur out to about the 300-foot depth. The northern extent of their range is limited by sea ice. So they'll move northward with sea ice, and then move south. And it retreats in the summer as it advances in the winter. And the southern limit of their distribution is more poorly understood, but likely has to do with water temperature, but also with productivity of the system. As you go down into the more temperate systems, the basic ocean productivity tends to decline. So, 1750, this is where we're going to start. There was approximately 300,000 sea otters, and that's based on the fur harvest records that over the next 150 years it resulted in the near extirpation of the species. But it's not a very firm number. We really don't know how many sea otters existed before the fur harvest. So the fur harvest began shortly after Bering did his explorations of the North Pacific and discovered, the first European to discover these large populations of sea otter, and with the fine pelt. This is a very valuable fur, worth quite a bit of money, and so they basically, they recruited, but actually they enslaved the Aleuts to catch sea otters. This was before firearms. And so the Aleuts had developed a fairly sophisticated communal way to hunt sea otters. They had spears. So you can see one Aleut hunter here, and you can see another hunter off in the distance there. And they would normally have, what I understand, 5 or 6 or 7 of these hunters in Bodkin with spears. They would basically search the nearshore zone, come across the sea otter would die, escape, and they would then basically perform a circle around where that animal will go. Because they have relatively limited diving abilities, basically they're creating a circle that you would hope the animal will come up to and then put a spear into it. And that's how they harvest sea otters, and that's how basically the fur trade began. Of course, once firearms came in to use, the hunt expanded quite a bit. But the Aleuts were the hunting methods were widely used in the early stages of the fur harvest. That began in about 1750. So by 1911, sea otters received formal protection, international protection by the International Fur Seal Treaty. But at that time, we really don't know how many sea otters were able to there. But they only occurred in these few locations. One in California, and one in Prince William Sound, which is not up in here. I will point it out. So this is Prince William Sound. There was a population there. There was one in Kodiak, two along the Alaska Peninsula, 3 separate populations here, and then one in Commander Island, Kamchatka Peninsula, and Kuril Island. It's estimated that there's probably a few thousand animals at that time. California, International First Field Treaty. So, and I'm free to answer questions if anybody has any. Raise your hand or just speak out. I'm happy to entertain any questions.
Don't mind me, I'm just a server as well.
They were killed. They were over-harvested. Yeah. Yeah. That was the sole reason for their near demise. So they were really on the precipice of extinction. One of the interesting things about this harvest is that it wasn't a large harvest per se. So if there were 300,000 animals, the average annual harvest was only 1 or 2%, which is almost certainly within kind of a sustainable harvest yield, if in fact they were trying to do that. But they did it over 150 years, and they did it in a way that kind of sequentially depleted populations as they went along. So they started over in the Kamchatka region, and they worked their way across the Aleutians into the Gulf of Alaska, and then down through southeast Alaska, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and California. So it was really, they were over-harvesting in a very specific way, and it's important because these animals don't move very much. Their annual home ranges, I'm going to show you some data, but are on the order of a few square kilometers. So they just don't move. And that's how they were able to overexploit them over such a long period of time at a relatively low rate, because the harvest was not proportional to the distribution. And that's why this wasn't sustainable. It's because these sea otters structure themselves, they have a very strong fidelity to their home range, and they have a very strong fidelity to other sea otters that they live with. Basically, they live and sleep and interact with the same individuals on a day-to-day basis. It's quite obvious that they have very strong social structure to their population. And it was this serial depletion that ended up in these local extinctions, or the near total extinction of the species. So, beginning in about, well, actually the first translocation was conducted by the Russians. They moved one sea otters well into the north of capital of Russia. Moscow. Up into the Arctic Ocean. It didn't work for obvious reasons. That was in the 1950s. But about 1950, we started moving sea otters into new habitat, basically to restore their populations. Now, the intent was to restore populations so that they could be harvested for their fur. And the problem was that it just took too long for that to occur. And by the time the populations had achieved levels where they might have had been harvested, the animals were being protected. So we went from a strategy of translocations for harvest to translocations for conservation and restoration of the population. So this is a kind of a similar figure of the North Pacific, and roughly 200,000 sea otters present here. And this covers the first decade of the 21st century. The ones that are highlighted in yellow over on the right are all translocated populations. So southeast Alaska, British Columbia, Washington, and then a population down in San Nicolas Island. Those were all reintroduced for the purpose of conservation. Those translocations began about the 1960s. The earlier translocations were out of the Pribilof Islands. They didn't succeed. There was one other translocation to Oregon. It didn't succeed about the same time as that of 1970.
So is the native California population?
Yes, it has. It's persisted. It hasn't grown a great deal. They estimate there was like 50 animals that persisted along the Big Sur coast. And today, the population is hovering around 2,500. And the growth rate has just been in low single digits. And in some years, it's actually declined. a lot of causes for that lack of growth in calcium. Things like diseases that are being introduced or transmitted through humans. Probably a lot of other causes as well. White sharks are a big one. So this is what the populations look like, and I'm going to show some graphs now, and you're going to identify each of these. So these over here, the real island, AI, KP is the Kamchatka Peninsula, Island, CI, Ocean Island, and then the North and South Alaska Peninsula, and the Gulf of Alaska. But before we do that, before I get into that, I want to show you how we catch sea otters. Just because it's kind of entertaining, people find it interesting, and I find it a lot of fun. So we use closed circuit rebreathers. We breathe pure oxygen. You'll notice that there's no bubbles, as I say that. We have to burst some bubbles out of his mask. So it's basically a bubble-free diving technology. We use these scooters, and you see the trap on the front of the scooter. And so imagine if you would a sea otter resting here up on the surface and we're underwater. We're going to come up underneath them with these traps. Basically push the trap up, the animal's going to dive into the trap, and we're going to pull the first string on that. There's webbing around there, and then the animal will be trapped in this. It's not quite as simple as it sounds. We have to be in the water maybe 300 or 400 yards away from the animals because they can't know we're there. They have to be asleep. So this is kind of this is edited down to just a few seconds to give you an idea of what their habitat looks like. So now we're signaling to the divers basically how far we have to go. I think there's something. You can see there's these animals resting on the top of the surface there. And that, you know that this has to be somewhat similar to an abduction from aliens, right? But it's the safest way we know to catch sea otters. They have virtually no injury or mortality associated with this, or some of the other methods we do. So it's a little bit slow down here so you can see the animals again. So they don't know we're here. You literally go up to them and touch them. And you have to be able to do that to catch them. So, and then this is the dive boat. It comes over, picks the animals up, and then we'll take them back in and process them on a larger ship. So here's a picture of an animal that's being processed for the study that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. You know, we'll basically do things like weigh them and measure them. We'll take tissue samples for health. That's Dr. Michael in the Monterey Bay Aquarium. He does all of the health examinations of the individual animals. We'll take a variety of different types of tissue. We'll take whiskers. We look at their diet and stabilize the foot. We'll estimate their ages from a vestigial pre-culture to.
That's sedated, or
It is sedated. Yeah, I'm sorry. These animals don't demonstrate any aggression to us until they're in these traps or boxes, and then they just really like to right, apparently. Until we sedate them, and then they're quite happy while they're sedated. And then they're reversed. We usually handle them for about a half an hour, and then they're released back into the environment. So it's really safe way for the animals to be handled and processed. So one of the things that we do is, I mentioned the oil spills, and one of the things that I've been doing for the past 23 years has been studying the effects of and the recovery of sea otters from Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1989. And so this is some data that came from them, and it helps us understand why sea otters are recovering so slowly. But this is simply a figure, home range of one individual. Each of the red circles indicates one breed site of the animal over the course of a year, and I think there's about 40 of them. And these are the home range estimates. And you can see that the numbers we're talking about are home ranges that are from 2 to 7 square kilometers. just a few cities. They don't range much. This is a layout. Some of them will range, up to tens, many tens of square kilometers. This is pretty typical for a male. Very small home ranges. So that has some real implications to kind of conservation and their biology because they don't move very far. And that has some implications relative to things like harvesting. You can't harvest all the animals in a very small area because the adjoining animals don't simply move back in there. It's not in their nature to kind of move into somebody else's territory when they have their own established territory. One of the things that we learned when we moved animals from Central California out to San Nicolas Island, one of the reasons that we took them out there, the island is a Navy island. It's protected by the Navy, and so there's relatively little human impact in the near shore zone around it. And also, likely because of that, there's an abundant invertebrate supply. So our thinking was, well, we'll take these animals from a place where they're likely having a hard time getting enough food. We'll take them to a place where the grocery shelves are full. And they should like it. This should be a good thing for them. Otherwise, if they didn't like it, they immediately 142 animals we took out there. 1 year later, there was 15 of them. And then they wanted to go home. They swam back. Many of them swam back to Monterey. Big circles where we caught them from. Some of them went south, but they didn't want to go to a place that they hadn't been before. It doesn't mean that we can't do successful translocations. It just means that we have to take a fairly large number of animals.
How did you know they went back to where you caught them? Were they tagged?
They were tagged. All the animals, we can't hardly handle an animal without putting a tag. It's just something, just something about our work that won't allow us to do that for a variety of different reasons. But in many cases, we'll have other types of instruments, things like radio transmitters, and that's how we learn where these animals were. But they did keep their tags, so we saw exactly from them. And this is just a compilation of home ranges. There's a scale bar down here. This is 6 different sea otters. They all have very distinct, almost non-overlapping home ranges. So, the width of this island here is probably on the order of 5 miles, maybe 12, 50 miles across. So it's a fairly small area. This is most of the adult males that live in that area. Yeah. No, I'm sorry. This is in Queenstown. So this is the area that was most severely impacted by the oil spill. Something like 90% of the sea otters that live in this area died in 1989. And the predictions were that recovery would take place within a couple of years as animals would move in and reoccupy vacant habitat. But it just didn't happen. And so here we are 23 years later, 22 years later, the last survey last year, and we're just now approaching the number of animals that we took out of here dead in 1989. So it's taken 27 years. Now that's not, there's probably some other reasons to speak up for that. Some of it has to do with it. There's still oil in the intertidal zone here. Not a lot, but there might be enough to deter animals from reestablishing themselves.
Why specifically is there towards there?
Oh, it has to do with the mathematics, basically. So that when the kernel in this range basically predicts the probability that there's a 50% probability of any location that we have within the and there's a 90% probability that all of them.
So it's just, it gives that name for
Right. So now we're going to go back to those individual sea otter populations that I pointed out on the map. They're going to basically go across here. So from California, they go north, Waterloo, southeast, Gulf of Alaska, the Alaska Peninsula, Ocean Islands, and data for Chattanooga Peninsula. Yeah.
We have a question here.
Oh, sorry. So they have a, I wish there was a way to explain this. They have a resource defense polygyny reproductive. Now what that means is that the males, have these kind of exclusive territory. They maintain, they keep other males out of it, but females are allowed to freely go from one territory to another. So they don't have that same type of territoriality that the males have, but they also have, but they have smaller home ranges as well. Not as small as these individual territories, but maybe twice the size of these home ranges. So these are territories because the males defend them against other males. But for the females, we call it a home range because there is no defense mechanism. They're pretty much allowed to go across the boundary. Although a male will try to keep a female if she's in his territory. Exactly.
What male would?
Yeah. So, I need to explain it. So here's these populations, and any of the bars that are above this line here, which is the zero growth line. So anybody that's right above this line is basically not growing. If the population is below it, it's basically declining. If it's above it, it's increasing. And this is about the theoretical maximum rate growth in the population of sea otters, based on the sex ratio in the population, about 65% females and 35% males, and reproductive interval. The female gives birth once a year, and she gives birth to only a single pup. So put all that together, and basically they can't grow at more than about 25%. Lifespan, there's animals in captivity that have been up to 28 years old. I think the oldest animal in the wild that we've aged is about 22 years. So, but those are the extremes. The averages is probably 12 to 14 years for a female and maybe 10 or 12 years for a male. They don't live as long. The female bears the reproductive burden, but really it's the male that pays the ultimate price, and he does so by dying a few years younger than the female. Probably because of the cost of maintaining these exclusive territories. So anyway, what I wanted to point out here was two things. One of them, that we have this area here, this population, South Alaska Peninsula, Aleutian Island, has been in kind of a catastrophic decline for about the past 15 years. And there's only one population in the Gulf of Alaska, and that was a subset of the Gulf of Alaska that is actually increasing at the maximum rate possible. So many of the populations are either in decline or they're growing at reduced rates.
What's the hypothesis for
We'll talk about those. First, we'll talk about this Alaska Peninsula, Aleutian Island population. It's been in basically catastrophic decline. It was listed in 2002 or 3 by the Fish and Wildlife Service as a threatened species, basically endangered species, just because of the magnitude of the decline. This basically shows the geographic range of that decline. This graph basically shows kind of the magnitude of that decline. So, about 1985, the population was roughly around 90,000 animals. And today, it's about 2 or 3,000. So, it's probably close to 2 or 3% remaining over there 25 years ago. So obviously this garnered a lot of attention, and so obviously the first question that you asked is, why did this happen? Why did we see this huge decline? And so there's some common common culprits, if you will, when it comes to wildlife population decline. They include things like disease, starvation, and contaminants, over-harvesting, or incidental bycatch fisheries. These are all things that we look for initially. But basically, none of these hypotheses fit with the actual data that we saw. Typically, when sea otter population, sea otter dies of disease because they live so close to shore that carcasses are washed out. And we've been recovering sea otter carcasses for 5 or 6 decades and have thousands of them in our collection. Yet we go out to the Aleutians, we found very few carcasses. Put out the Aleutians during the decline and watch the animals feeding, and they weren't having any trouble finding food. They had a very high rate of food intake. We tested tissues in their body for contaminants, and we're pretty sure that there's the Aleutian Islands. Anybody ever been to the Aleutian Islands? It's pretty remote. It's very difficult place to get there. There's only a few settlements, if you will, that charter, ADAC, a few military installations, and harvest, and there's very few fisheries out there as well. So these are all kind of inconsistent with the data. But one thing that wasn't inconsistent is the data. These are not sea otters. This is a harbor seal, and this is a harbor seal. So these two whales have small marine mammals in their mouth. So predation was one of the other topics or causes that we would investigate. And it turns out that there was, although the evidence is not compelling, it's the most compelling evidence, and there have been no other hypotheses that have been advanced that offer any consistent cause with the data that we have here. So it probably was telling, I wasn't convinced, I was a skeptic of this hypothesis of killer whales were killing all of those sea otters in the Aleutian Islands until I went out there in the early 90s. We were catching sea otters. We were catching them with that method that I showed you. And I've been doing this for 3 years, catching otters this way. And what I saw was these animals, and they were disturbed. When they detected us underwater, they left the water. So that was just a complete surprise. Never before I'd seen anything like that. So they would get out of the water. So up on land, they would, and then we started looking more closely, and it turns out that their distribution had changed remarkably. Previously, they used to occur in these kelp beds that went far offshore. And now they only occur where they have refuge or an escape refuge, which I think is a clear indication that a predator might be involved in this. You're not going to be able to see any of the slides there.
Right into the middle here.
Oh, now that's in the way. That's I didn't see that. I'll catch you guys up. Basically, talking about decline in the Aleutian Islands over the past 25 years, and decline from 90,000 down to about 2,000. And here's the light growth. I mean, it's what they do for me. At least certain types. And just another image, a colleague of ours has been putting out some very interesting tags in juvenile stellar sea lions. So these are stellar sea lions on the rocks, and there's a couple of killer whales swimming around hunting. And so he put these life history tags out, and what they are is they record the internal body temperature and the diving behavior of the sea die a slow death, okay, your body it's going to cool down, and it's going to cool down at a very slow rate because there's a lot of thermal mass that has to cool down. Now, if you're predated upon by a killer whale, that doesn't take quite so long. And that instrument immediately goes into the water, or it goes into the killer whale, and then it assumes the killer whale's diving behavior and not the sea lion. So it's really fascinating work, and it's pointing to really a significant role that killer whales are playing in the decline of stealth sea lions.
Why over the past 5 years was active more rarely rather than previously?
Yeah, well, that's less clear. But there's an intriguing hypothesis that some other colleagues came up with that basically draws us back to the industrial whaling and basically the cessation of industrial whaling. And the idea being that these killer whales used to rely more on the great whales as a prey. We, through industrial whaling, reduced the numbers of those great whales in our population. And therefore, the killer whales started preying on things like stellar sea lions and things like harbor seals, and then eventually worked their way down kind of the energetic ladder until they ended up with sea otters. Now, it's a controversial theory. It's not widely accepted, but it's a theory that has some foundation in the data. Well, because some people just don't. Some scientists don't think that the data are conclusive or necessarily consistent. And there's a lot of uncertainty in these types of data, population data, or more importantly, in dietary data. So I have a killer whale friend, a biologist, who works here at the Seattle Marine Mammal Laboratory, and when I talked to her about this, she said she had spent 13 years monitoring killer whales in Southeast Alaska. She had observed something like 2 dozen predation events. Okay, over the course of 13 years. So we don't really have a very good idea of the diet based on a very small sample size like that. And there's obviously the potential for some strong biases in which type of whale you're looking at and the seasonality of it. So these aren't rare events. These animals eat regularly. Almost all predators eat on a fairly regular basis, otherwise they die. But predation is a fairly rare event to observe. In most cases, I'll talk a little bit about how sea otters differ because they bring all of their prey to the surface. They live close to shore, and with a telescope you can watch what they're eating. You can identify and count the number of things that they're eating. So it's like giving birth. There's been a handful of observations by humans of sea otters giving birth, but yet we know that they do it. We just don't see it. It happens. So anyway, that's part of the controversy. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about sea otter ecology. So they provide perhaps the best example in the ecological literature of a keystone species. And what that means is that by virtue of their diet, their feeding behavior, they have a very strong influence on this community that they live in. And in this sense, it's an ecological community, and it has to do primarily with these urchins. So I talked a bit about how we took these animals out to San Nicolas Island, and the bottom was littered with urchins, as well as things like abalones and crab and big snails, lobsters, all kinds of large invertebrate prey. And what the animals that stayed out there ate was urchins. So this is kind of their preferred prey. And what's interesting is that urchins are basically herbivores, and they're grazing herbivores. So they will completely denude their rocky habitat of any kind of algal growth. And this is so these are just a couple of the images. The one in the upper left is, all those kind of little green objects are green urchins that are about the size, half the size of maybe the size of a golf ball. And as you can see, there's virtually no kelp in this system, and none of the associated fauna that lives in these kelp forests. And you've seen this throughout the range of sea otters. And one of the great things about the fur harvest was it allowed us to contrast these ecosystems both in the presence and in the absence of sea otters. So if we wouldn't have had that opportunity, we may have never seen a picture like this. But because we removed them from such a large proportion of their range and we encouraged their recovery, we've been able to kind of use that as a kind of an experimental effect or experimental treatment to better understand what sea otters do in their environment. And this is just one example, but it's probably the best example. So the point being that sea otters have a very profound effect on the habitat that they live in by virtue of what they're consuming. And it's not relegated simply to these rocky reefs, but it also occurs in soft sediment habitats where clams or other types of organisms occur, although it may not be directly related to kelp. But sea otters in general have a very strong effect on the flora and the fauna of the habitat that they occupy. So, kind of summarizing that graph, what we have now is that there's trends in the abundance of sea otters that span a wide range. From populations that are in catastrophic decline to populations that are kind of hovering around no change to a few populations that are actually increasing. Now, and some of these populations exhibit kind of divergent trends. And what I mean by that is that, so if we think about the population of sea otters on the Vancouver Island coast, on the west coast of Vancouver Island, we moved them there in the 1970s, and in the center of that habitat, where we moved them, the populations are pretty stable. They're not growing very rapidly there, but they are growing more rapidly near the ends of the range. So that's what I mean by that. So that's an important concept because we're going to use that kind of in an experimental way. But at the same time, there's various threats to sea otters at a variety of different scales. And these include things that are density-dependent factors. And that's probably related to the amount of food that they have available. But there's also density-independent factors, things like watershed influences. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about those, as well as the potential for oceanic influences, things that are coming from the oceans that might be affecting these populations. So now I'm going to start talking about the specific nearshore project. And this is a project that I started 3 years ago. And it's primarily sponsored by the U.S. Geological Survey. And people always want to know, well, why is the U.S. Geological Survey studying animals? And it has to do with a reorganization of the federal government that's really kind of boring, but it goes back to Al Gore and the conflicts between forest management and forest science. And anyway, so they wanted to remove the science from the management organizations. And so they basically put us into the Geological Survey, which wasn't responsible for any kind of biological management. Anyway, we're there, and they have a variety of science centers, and 3 of those are participating in this study. And there's partners from the National Park Service, the Monterey Bay Aquarium, Seattle Aquarium, DFO Canada, and the University of Wyoming, and now the University of Michigan and the University of Idaho. And I'll talk a little bit about the various types of expertise that these other organizations are bringing in. But it's kind of a simple question, and it's a question that we've been asking for decades. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Carl Kenyon. He was a renowned naturalist from the Seattle area, worked in the Aleutian Islands, and also worked on sea otters. And I had the good fortune to work with him early in my career, and we discussed this very question then. And that is, what are the factors that are contributing to the status and trends of sea otter populations? And this is not a question that's unique to sea otters, but it can be expanded to most wildlife species. But maybe more importantly, can we extend what's happening to sea otters to what's happening in the environment that they live in, or their ecosystems? And that's the nature of the project that I've been engaged in for the past 3 years, and will take me through to the end of my career. So now I want to have you think about what the oceans are. When somebody says the ocean, or when you think of the ocean, what do you envision? So I think we probably all have a bit of a different vision, because obviously it's an immense and dominant feature of our globe. But I think of the oceans, I think of that. I think of the 70% of the surface that's covered by oceans. And I think of basically a featureless landscape on the surface, but one that probably does have some features at great depths. And I also think of a system that's dominated, where the productivity in the system, the primary productivity, the fuel that drives the biology in the system, comes from phytoplankton. So we're all familiar with that, and then the zooplankton that feeds on that, and then the trophic levels that go above that. So that's, I'm going to use that as my definition of the ocean. This system where the primary producers in the system are the phytoplankton. Zooplankton are the secondary, so the primary consumers, and then it feeds up. But this takes place generally offshore. Now when I think about the continents, you have a very different picture. It's basically land masses. But in the context of the oceans, these land masses form the interface between the ocean and the continents. And by a simple fate of gravity, all of the material on those continents will eventually flow into the ocean. Now, we don't want to consider things like uplifting and tectonic forces, but nonetheless, things that happen in the watersheds flow into the ocean. I think we're all pretty familiar with that concept. So, now I want to talk about the near shore. So, I talked a little bit about where sea otters live, and how that's essentially near shore based on depth. Although in the Bering Sea they can occur 10 or 20 miles offshore, and that's because the shallow shelf extends very far offshore there. But in general, these animals live very close to shore, again, usually within a few hundred meters of the shoreline. And so what I want to talk about is the potential for ocean influences and for watershed influences to kind of meet and affect this very thin boundary layer, if you will, between the continents and the oceans. And we're going to call that the nearshore zone. And so obviously, the ocean is a fluid place. Things move, across these boundaries, and they're not uniform boundaries, but there are some distinctions here, as well as some similarities. But the distinctions are that in this nearshore zone, most of the productivity in the system, most of that carbon that is fixed by photosynthesis is from the kelps, in many cases. So, more than 50% of the primary productivity in the nearshore zone is coming from the kelps in that zone. And then the rest of it can be coming from that source of carbon that's being transported by currents inshore from the offshore zone. The other feature of the nearshore that is unique is that it's tied to depth. Basically, it's tied very much to that photic zone. And organisms and algae in particular that grow on the bottom that require light. So they can't move. And so we're going to define that nearshore zone, and we're going to look at ways that factors that are internal to the nearshore might be affecting sea otter populations. We're also going to consider the potential that factors in the ocean and factors in the watersheds could also be impacting that nearshore zone. And so this is just a kind of a different way to look at that. In the center here we have the sea otter population and status and trend. Is the population increasing? Is it declining? And then we have these three, I don't want to think of them as competing hypotheses, but alternative hypotheses. So the top one being, diet and nutrition. Are the grocery store shelves just not full enough to basically provide these animals with the nutrition that they need? We have some ways to look at that. And then on the bottom right, we have watershed inputs, and this is almost certainly independent of sea otter density. I mean, it doesn't matter how many sea otters are there, that doesn't affect the watershed. As well as on this bottom left, breed productivity. And one of the important points here is that we've been asking this question for decades, but we haven't had the technology to answer these questions until very recently. And a lot of that has to do with advancing technologies and the fact that 10 to 15, almost 20 years ago, we began putting satellites in orbit that take images of our planet. And so we can go back now and recreate some of the information needs that we have to have in order to test these alternative hypotheses. And we'll be able to talk about that. And we're also taking some advancing technologies from human medicine and transferring those to look at the health of sea otters. So it's very much a reflection of human advancement and human development of technology. It's allowed us to finally at least try to answer those questions that we asked long ago. So here's kind of the spatial. We talked about that's the conceptual design of the study, and this is the spatial design. So over the past 3 years, I had the remarkable opportunity to visit each of these circles and sample sea otter populations, catch sea otters, sample their diet through visual observations. We caught fish, and I'll explain why. We've also extracted satellite data from these same circles, and so we're going to bring all of these data from all of these locations together to try to answer that question. So now we're going to take just a brief tour from the Katmai Coast, which is up here, kind of the northern Gulf of Alaska. It's a national park, and we're going to basically take a trip down to central California from the Katmai Coast. And just a few images of each one, and I'm just going to try to point out the striking differences between those. And they'll be very evident, but they're also kind of pretty pictures. So the Katmai Coast, very geologically active, very recent in terms of its geologic origin. The coast there was affected by a 1906 earthquake or a volcano eruption that put tens of meters of ash on the landscape, basically killed everything. So you'll see, pictures like this. There's no forest, there's no trees. It just hasn't. Succession hasn't allowed forests to recolonize. So it's very young, both geologically as well as biologically and ecologically. And it's dominated. It's a landscape dominated by what our environment here used to look like several hundred years ago. Large carnivores kind of dominate the fauna. There was 10 bears feeding on this dead whale carcass on the Katmai Coast. A little bit further to the south and to the east is Prince William Sound. So another feature, glaciers, or I should have said this, the Katmai is also dominated by glacial ice caps that cover these mountains. So there's temperature extremes, and there's a great deal of precipitation, both as snow and as rain. And Prince William Sound has a similar climate, but it's a little bit older in terms of the ecological and biological communities, and that it's had time for the landscapes to develop kind of large forests. And these are forests that have been relatively unlogged. So they're fairly pristine forests. These are old-growth forests. They're not huge forests because of the latitude that they create. But for the most part, there's been relatively little logging taking place in Prince William Sound. But it's also kind of the terminus for the Alaska pipeline. So all of the oil that's coming off the Alaska slope transits through Prince William Sound right via these tankers. Of course, resulting in the Exxon Valdez spill some 23 years ago. So we're starting to see the footprint of human activity in Prince William Sound. Southeast Alaska, again, it's been deglaciated for a much longer period of time. Again, this is a good example of great sea otter habitat that protected waters, kind of with offshore open ocean beyond, barrier islands influencing. Large stands of trees. This is a stand of tree in Glacier Bay that they have a great chronology of the rate of glacial recession in Glacier Bay because of, I guess it was Cook in 1750, sailed by Glacier Bay, and it was the terminus of the glacier was at the mouth of the bay, and now it's nearly 100 miles receded. And so this is a forest that's about 200 years old. Our next stop is Tofino, out on the outer BC coast, and this is the kind of the first place that we see welcome signs, signs of again human occupation, of an increasing footprint or presence of humans on the landscape. A landscape dominated by trees, most of them second or third growth trees, but still a few old growth trees around. But a landscape that's been affected by human activities in terms of primarily the timber industry, but also in terms of mariculture operations, huge both shell fisheries and fin fishery mariculture operations. But these have influences in this nearshore zone. A traffic jam. This was the first traffic jam that we saw as we kind of traveled down from the Gulf of Alaska. Our next stop was Forks. You guys are probably a little more familiar with Forks. We worked on the Olympic Coast last year. Again, pretty similar to BC, and I think in its history of its landscape and its human impacts on there in terms of logging. But a difference here is that the coastline is protected by national parks and national sanctuaries. So there's probably less of an influence of human influence in the marine